Statrollers, Bill with RollStats. Back in November of 2004, Dungeon Magazine, issue number 116, published what quickly became one of the most talked about features in the magazine's history. A ranked list of the 30 greatest D&D adventures of all time. And let me tell you, folks have been poring over it, praising it, arguing about it, and dissecting every choice ever since. I mean, that's the thing with lists like this. They're never perfect, and they're not supposed to be. No ranking is going to match up exactly with everyone's personal top picks, and that's part of what makes it so much fun. Reading through the list again, especially the comments from the folks who helped build it, reminds me of why I fell in love with this hobby in the first place. It brought me right back to those late nights around the kitchen table, those campaigns that spiraled way off the rails in the best possible way. The times the dice betrayed us, the times the dice saved us, the laughter, the groans, the quiet moments of just awe when we realized, that our story had become something bigger than we had planned for, something bigger than we had ever expected. And more than anything, it makes me want to go back, to crack open those modules again, to see how they hold up, to remember what made them special, and to maybe introduce them to a few new players who never had the chance to experience them the first time around. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. In the coming weeks and months, I'll be revisiting each of the adventures from Dungeon's top 30 list, starting at number 30 and working my way up to number 1. I'll be taking a closer look at what makes each one tick, how it holds up for an old school dungeon master like me, what kind of table it's best suited for, and how you might want to tweak it to suit your own game. So, whether you're thinking about running one of these adventures for yourself, or you just want to come along for the nostalgia trip, I hope you'll stick around for this. This is going to be a good one. So it's time to roll back the clock, crack open those old modules, and see if these adventures really are the greatest of all time. Let's find out together. But first, let's review the list starting at number 30. There's a certain magic to the old school modules that just didn't care about logic as long as the adventure was memorable. And the Ghost Tower of Inverness is a perfect example of that philosophy. From the moment a mysterious seer sends your party off to retrieve a priceless sword from the top of an invisible tower, you're about to be thrown into something delightfully unhinged. The dungeon is less a coherent structure and more a series of wild set pieces, a lethal chessboard floor, a reverse gravity chamber, traps that seem designed purely to torment your players rather than protect treasure. It's all gloriously chaotic, but by today's standards, the design is pretty out there, right? Even Monty Cook described it as a collection of cliches, but he also acknowledged its place in the foundation of D&D's dungeon design. I mean, back when Ghost Tower first dropped, those so-called cliches were fresh and thrilling, right? It challenged players to think on their feet, embrace the absurd, and accept that not everything in a dungeon needed a tidy explanation. It wasn't about realism. It wasn't meant to be. It was about wonder, surprise, and testing your wits against a world that really plays by its own rules. That's what makes it so enduring. It might be a madhouse, sure, but it's a fun madhouse. And for those of us raised on classic modules, this was our introduction to the idea that a dungeon could be anything: a puzzle box, a house of horrors, a strange artifact of forgotten magic. It didn't have to make sense to make an impression. It just had to be unforgettable. And Ghost Tower of Inverness, yeah, it absolutely is. Some modules never quite get the spotlight they deserve, and the Assassin's Knot is absolutely one of them. It didn't come with flashy dragons or sprawling dungeons, and it never hit the iconic status of its louder siblings. But if you're into mystery, roleplay, and a more grounded kind of tension, this one delivers in spades. John Ratliff called it one of the most underrated adventures ever published, and honestly, I have to say I agree with him. Instead of kicking in doors and looting crypts, your party is dropped into the middle of a murder investigation in the village of Garoten. The hook is simple, right? Someone important is dead, and the killer is still hiding somewhere in town. What unfolds after that is a tense, time-sensitive mystery full of twists, red herrings, and really truly meaningful choices. It's a module that actually expects your players to pay attention, to ask questions, and to engage with the world beyond the tip of their sword, right? This was a big deal at the time, and to be honest with you, it still feels fresh today. I mean, what really made the Assassin's Knot a game changer, though, was how it treated its villains. They weren't just static encounters waiting in locked rooms. The villains in Assassin's Knot had routines, they had goals, they had a timeline. The bad guys were out there doing their thing, and your players had to catch up before things got worse. That sense of a living world, one that didn't revolve around your players, was a revelation. It added urgency and weight to the story. And if you're a fan of the old school style, but want to lean into narrative and consequence, this one's a must. It may not have the fame, but it absolutely has the substance. So, beneath the sun-baked sands lies one of the most haunting and evocative ruins in all of old-school Dungeons & Dragons, the Ziggurat of Sinistera, the last crumbling remnant of a once-great civilization swallowed by madness and myth. This isn't just a dungeon, it's the decaying heart of a fallen empire, overrun by the strange legacy of a civilization undone by the arrival of Zargon, a monstrous entity whose corruption brought their world to ruin. What's left are masked survivors scattered into 3 bizarre factions, each clinging to a warped version of their culture, and the whole thing feels like you've stepped into a dream that's turned slightly wrong. And I mean that in the best way possible. This is one of my favorite modules, and I'm surprised it didn't score higher on the list. What makes this adventure truly shine is how much depth it offers beyond the typical crawl. Sure, there's plenty of classic dungeon delving to be had inside the Ziggurat. Traps, monsters, secrets galore, but it also opens up into something much bigger. You've got layers of political intrigue, lost history, and the eerie day-to-day lives of the Sinisterians to explore, right? The module even gives you the tools to expand the adventure beyond the Ziggurat itself, diving into a vast underground city teeming with forgotten mysteries and the looming presence of Zargon himself. This isn't just about treasure, it's about piecing together the remnants of a lost world and maybe trying to save it before the last flicker of sanity disappears for good. For my money, this is one of the most atmospheric and memorable old school modules out there. It nails that old school sweet spot between weird fantasy and dungeon adventure, and while giving your players a chance to actually shape the fate of something bigger than themselves. It's not just a crawl, it's a descent into a strange, beautiful ruin of a world that feels like it's been waiting for someone to remember it. So the sinister secret of Saltmarsh starts out like your typical haunted house crawl. An old alchemist manor, whispers of strange happenings, and the promise of dusty treasure. But what makes it so brilliant is how quickly it throws that formula out the window. What seems like a slow burn investigation into supernatural spooks turns into a full-blown coastal thriller, complete with smugglers, double-crossers, and a saboteur hiding in plain sight. You think you've walked into the house on the hill, right? But by the time the plot hits its stride, you're caught up in something that feels more like the Count of Monte Cristo meets Scooby-Doo. And again, in the best way possible. What I love about this one is the shift in tone and setting. It's not just confined to creaky floorboards and suspicious townfolk. It opens up into a seafaring caper, and the transition is seamless. The manor is loaded with secrets, hidden passages, and eerie misdirection, but the moment it pivots to the smuggler's ship, everything accelerates. You're no longer poking around for clues. You're chasing leads, confronting conspirators, and maybe swinging a sword on the deck of a ship while the tide rolls in. Christopher Perkins summed it up perfectly. A simple haunted house tale with pirates. And somehow, that mashup works really, really well. This one is a testament to the power of a well-paced narrative and smart design. It's not about massive maps or world-ending threats. It's about mystery, mood, and the thrill of discovering that the story you thought you were playing is about to veer wildly off course. For my money, it's one of the best modules to run when you want something punchy, surprising, and just a little bit salty, right? If your players like a twist, and let's be honest, who doesn't, right? This one absolutely deserves a spot back at your table. So City of Skulls does not waste time with pleasantries. It throws your players straight into the frigid, ironclad heart of Ayuza's hellish domain, where every breath feels watched and every shadow might hold your end. The premise is simple: break into the halls of wretchedness and rescue a vital prisoner. But the execution, it's a masterclass in pressure and paranoia. This isn't your standard dungeon crawl. This is a high-stakes infiltration into one of the most dangerous corners of Greyhawk. And survival is in no way guaranteed. What makes the adventure so damn compelling is the notoriety system. Every action your party takes, every sword drawn, every spell cast, every suspicious glance increases their risk of exposure. The more noise they make, the more the net tightens. Eventually, they're not just dodging guards. They're on the radar of forces that could crush a small army. It's a brilliant mechanic that forces your players to think differently. They're not heroes here. They're intruders behind enemy lines, and they need to act like it. For players who are used to solving problems with fireballs and bravado, this is a whole new kind of challenge, let me tell you. And I love how City of Skulls builds tension, not through endless combat, but through the threat of it, right? The oppressive cold, the ever-present eye of Ayuza's minions, the knowledge that one wrong move could blow the whole mission. It's relentless. And when your party finally pulls off the rescue and escapes the jaws of evil, it feels earned. It's not a power fantasy. It's survival horror wrapped in a political thriller. And, if you want a module that pushes your players to be clever, cautious, and just a little bit scared, this one's an absolute must-play. So Dragons of Despair wasn't just the first module in the Dragonlance saga. It was a bold declaration that Dungeons & Dragons could be something more than just dungeon delving and monster slaying. Released in 1984 and penned by Tracy Hickman, this adventure took everything we thought we knew about how a module was supposed to work and turned it on its head. Gone were the aimless loot hunts and, disconnected encounters. In their place was a sweeping, emotional epic with real stakes, cinematic moments, and a world teetering on the brink of catastrophe. For many of us, this module was the first time D&D felt like an actual story, something larger than us, not just a game. Set in the war-scarred world of Krynn, Dragons of Despair thrusts your players into a narrative full of loss, myth, and rediscovery. The gods are silent, magic is dying, and ancient dragons have returned to the world. And not as lone monsters in lairs, but as terrifying engines of conquest. Your party's journey leads them through ruined cities and lost temples, culminating in a showdown with the black dragon Tsojcanth in a crumbling, trap-filled ruin. And while the adventure leans heavily on its story-driven structure, including, the controversial use of pre-generated characters, it laid the groundwork for how modules could deliver emotional arcs and world-shaping consequences. I mean, sure, it's not perfect. It's a bit railroady, and some players don't like the idea of stepping into someone else's character. But what Dragons of Despair achieved was nothing short of revolutionary. It told us that D&D could be dramatic, it could be moving, it could build a living world worth fighting for. It's one of the reasons Dragonlance became a phenomenon, right? Like, not just a setting, but a saga. And to this day, that final battle in Zaxxaroth remains one of the most memorable moments in classic module history. So City of the Spider Queen is an absolute monster of an adventure. A deep dive into the Underdark that doesn't just raise the stakes, it cranks them up to 11, and then lights the whole thing on fire. Set in the Forgotten Realms during Lolth's Divine Silence, it picks up right in the middle of one of the most chaotic moments in Drow history. Everything's gone sideways. The goddess is quiet, the hierarchy is collapsing, and the whole twisted web of Drow society is starting to unravel. Into that chaos steps your party, chasing down a series of disappearances in Daggerdale that lead them straight into a demon-infested nightmare. What makes this module stand out is the sheer scope of it. So Mir Midra, the burning city at the heart of it all, is a perfect backdrop for madness. Your party isn't just fighting monsters here, though, there are plenty of those, including some fresh horrors cooked up just for this adventure, but They're navigating shifting alliances, unraveling secrets, and trying to survive in a place where the bad guys aren't just evil, they're desperate, they're insane, and they're very powerful. The Underdark has always been deadly, but City of the Spider Queen turns it into a crucible. It's one of those adventures where your players will remember exactly where they were when things went completely and totally off the rails. It's not a plug-and-play dungeon crawl, right? This is the kind of module that you as the DM prep for, and you prep for it hard. It's sprawling, politically charged, and packed with detail, but if you're the kind of DM who loves complex villains, brutal environments, and the kind of dread-soaked storytelling that makes the realms feel genuinely dangerous, this one absolutely delivers. Just make sure someone brought a cleric, or two, because by the time the party reaches Mirmidra, they're going to need all the divine help they can get, trust me. So this one lures you in with the old bait and switch, right? A seemingly straightforward mission to hunt down some rampaging humanoids in the mountains. The kind of job a seasoned party can handle without breaking a sweat, right? But, as any good old school DM knows, the best adventures are the ones that start with something simple and spiral into something way, way bigger. That's exactly what happens here. Instead of finding just orcs and ogres, your party uncovers something ancient, something sleeping, and something that probably should have stayed that way, right? What begins as a wilderness crawl quickly morphs into a descent into forgotten darkness, as your players find themselves face to face with the resting place of one of Greyhawk's most infamous dark gods. This isn't just some dusty tomb or monster den, it's a buried cancer of pure evil sealed away by time and fear. Bruce Cordell said it best, evil never dies, it just sleeps away the eons in weird cysts waiting for foolish adventurers to disturb it. And disturb it they will. The deeper the party goes, the more the dread builds, until they're not just dealing with monsters, they're grappling with myth, consequence, and the realization that they've awakened something that the world just wasn't ready for. This adventure is a love letter to the classic Greyhawk style. It's moody, it's slow burning, and it's packed with the kind of tension that creeps up on you until it's too late to turn back. It rewards careful play, and it punishes recklessness, all while offering that delicious mix of exploration and existential dread. If you're looking to run a module that really captures the feel of poking into ancient, forgotten places with stakes that go way beyond the surface, this one's a masterclass. Just maybe don't tell your players what they're getting into. Let them dig their own grave. That's half the fun, right? So this adventure is a straight-up relic of D&D's early days, and I mean that in the best way. It's a reissue of one of the very first tournament modules, and you can feel it in the bones of the design. The players head into the forbidding Yatil Mountains on the trail of Igwil's long-lost treasure. And if you're a Greyhawk fan like I am, you know that name carries weight. Igwil is the kind of villain whose reputation lingers like a curse, and her shadow looms large over every twist and turn of this dungeon. You're not just delving for gold, you're poking around in the ashes of one of the setting's deadliest legends, right? Sure, the dungeon layout can feel a bit basic if you're used to more modern or narratively complex designs, but that rawness, that's part of the charm. It's brutally honest, old school D&D. Limited resources, no safety nets, and monsters that don't care about your story arc, right? What elevates it beyond a standard crawl is the wilderness journey leading up to the dungeon. This isn't just a quick jaunt from town to lair. It's a full-on expedition, and your players are going to feel the weight of the journey, the isolation, the danger. It creates a fantastic sense of scale and tone, especially for groups that enjoy that old-school Lost in the Wilds vibe. And let's not forget Booklet 2. That thing was a revelation when it dropped, introducing over 30 new monsters, many of them still bizarre and dangerous enough to keep modern players on their toes, right? And between the trek, the traps, the unfamiliar enemies, and the ever-present legacy of Igwil, this module delivers something that's rare in today's adventures. Pure, focused, survivalist fantasy. It's a piece of D&D history, rough edges and all, and if you run it with the right group, it'll remind you just how potent that early magic still is. So this one is a deep cut from the golden era of Judge's Guild, and let me tell you, it's everything a true dungeon crawler could hope for. Right from the start, the tone is set with a disturbingly atmospheric village that practically oozes dread, right? Easily one of the creepiest settings ever printed. But that's just the opening act. The real meat is the dungeon itself, a vast, multi-level labyrinth built around 2 buried towers. And it's not just a matter of going down. You gotta fight your way back up again, right? That structure alone adds a whole extra layer of tension and strategy that you don't really often see in modules even today. And what makes this adventure sing is how alive it feels. It's not just rooms full of random monsters waiting for their turn to die. There are 2 opposing factions clashing within the dungeon, each with their own goals and territory, and the players can interact with both or, be crushed between them. And that kind of dynamic world building was way ahead of its time, and it makes every decision matter. It forces your players to think beyond hit points and loot. Who do they trust? Who do they sabotage? Can they play one side against the other? All of it adds up to a living, breathing, and possibly dying world under the earth. John Ratliff called this one a bar raiser, and I couldn't agree more. It's a module that demands smart play, rewards exploration, and doesn't hold back on the horror or challenge. The final encounter is downright nightmarish, and if your party makes it that far, they'll have earned every moment of it, trust me. If you and your players are ready for a true test, the kind of dungeon where the walls seem to close in and every choice could spell disaster, this is the one to run, my friend. It's not just a dungeon crawl, it's a crucible. So if you were rolling dice in the early 80s, then you know. The Slavelords were the villains to beat, right? Like, this wasn't some random necromancer in a cave or a goblin king with delusions of grandeur. The Slavelords were an organized, brutal network of slavers who operated with cold precision and terrifying effectiveness. So originally released as a 4-part series, A1 through A4, later bundled into the super module Scourge of the Slavelords, this campaign was gritty, relentless, and unforgettable. It gave us a clear moral imperative. Take down the evil, dismantle the system, and it made us earn every victory along the way. What sets this series apart is how much it demanded of the players. From the seedy corruption of Highport to the volcanic stronghold of Suderham, the arc takes adventurers through infiltration missions, slave riots, treacherous caverns, and confrontations with villains that felt personal, right? The Slavelords themselves weren't faceless baddies. They were distinct, dangerous, and smart. You didn't just fight them, you hunted them. And when the showdown finally came, it felt earned. Add in the Gen Con tournament roots and that ticking clock baked into its DNA, and you've got a campaign that was tight, tense, and ruthlessly designed to push players to their limits. I mean, even now, Scourge of the Slavelords stands as a high point in classic adventure design. It's a campaign that doesn't just tell a story. It tests your players' resolve, their creativity, and their tactical mettle. And that final eruption when the volcano explodes and everything goes sideways, that's the stuff of legend. If you've never run it, you're in for a masterclass in old school adventure pacing. If you have, you know exactly why this one still deserves a seat at the high table of classic D&D. So Against the Cult of the Reptile God is one of those rare early modules that doesn't just drop your players into danger, it unsettles them first, right? Douglas Niles worked magic here. He managed to breathe life into the village of Orlane with remarkable skill. From the moment your players arrive, something feels off. Smiles don't quite reach the eyes, right? The local innkeeper seems nervous. The temple feels more oppressive than holy. That creeping sense of paranoia, it builds fast. And soon, your players are questioning everything and everyone. And, with good reason, right? The brilliance of this adventure is how it blends investigation, social interaction, and dungeon crawling into a single cohesive experience. I mean, the cult's influence runs deep, and because the entire village has been compromised, there are no safe places to rest and regroup. That tension, the sense that danger is always one wrong question away, makes this module feel more like a psychological thriller than a standard fantasy romp. When your party finally uncovers the source of the corruption, they descend into a damp, crumbling lair that feels just as unstable as the minds of the people they've left behind. I mean, it's the perfect capstone to the slow burn of dread that the village builds up so masterfully. What really makes this module shine, for me, is its replayability and long-term value. Once the cult's been rooted out, or Lane doesn't have to vanish from your campaign, it can become a base of operations, or the trauma of what happened there can echo into future adventures. I mean, it's rich, it's flexible, and genuinely haunting. If your group enjoys mystery, tension, and a challenge that leans more on trust and intuition than brute strength, Against the Cult of the Reptile God is a must-run for you. It's one of those adventures that gets under your skin and just stays there. So the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan is what happens when classic dungeon crawling crashes headfirst into pulpy Mesoamerican myth, right? It throws your party straight into the steaming, tangled heart of the Amedio jungle and doesn't let up. The setup is already gold, right? The party's fleeing a bounty hunter, desperate and off the map, only to stumble into the remnants of a lost civilization. But this isn't your standard explore the ruins fare. This is fever dream territory. Poisonous amber mist seeps from the cracks, forgotten gods whisper through the stone, and somewhere inside, a hermit crab starts talking. What makes this module sing, beyond the lush setting and just straight up bonkers encounters, is the vibe, right? Like, this place feels alive. Every room has its own surreal little moment, whether it's a trapped hallway that plays like a vision quest or a deity fading into myth before your eyes. The fact that TSR bundled it with a player illustration booklet was a stroke of genius. It gave DMs an easy way to show, not just tell. And that visual storytelling made the whole place feel more immersive and uncanny. Think Tomb of Horrors meets Apocalypto with just a dash of a talking crustacean, right? I mean, there's a reason this one sticks in everyone's memory. It's dangerous, it's weird, and above all, it dares to be different. It's not just about surviving the traps, though there are plenty of those. It's about stepping into a myth-soaked world that doesn't care if you understand it, only that you respect it. If your group's up for a good old-fashioned crawl with extra flavor and a thick layer of jungle madness, the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan is ready to swallow them whole. So the Ruins of Undermountain is what happens when you hand a wizard with too much power a blank check and ask him to design you a dungeon. This is Ed Greenwood's magnum opus Beneath Waterdeep, a mega dungeon so vast, so intricate, and so ridiculously detailed that it basically begs you to build an entire campaign around it. The initial 3 levels are already more dungeon than most groups will ever see, but then it drops the tantalizing promise of 6 more sprawling layers hidden below. I mean, it's the ultimate open-ended dungeon delve, and if you're a DM who likes room to breathe and build, there's nothing quite like it. What makes Undermountain more than just a big dungeon, though, is its relationship with Waterdeep. The city above isn't just a quest hub. It's a living, breathing part of the story. Factions scheme, nobles meddle, and taverns whisper rumors about the horrors below, right? And then there's Hallister Blackcloak, the maddest of mad wizards, whose presence infuses the place with a kind of unpredictable, arcane madness. The dungeon isn't just dangerous, it's weird. Rooms flip reality, monsters act on bizarre compulsions. Magic behaves like it's been drinking, right? Like, that chaos makes every delve feel like a new experience, even if you've been there before. The original box set is a masterclass in dungeon crafting. It's not a scripted story. It's a toolbox packed to bursting with maps, new monsters, spells, items, and just enough lore to get your gears turning, right? It doesn't lead you by the hand. It dares you to take the reins and make it your own. And for those of us who love sandbox play, unpredictable encounters, and campaigns that evolve organically over time, the Ruins of Undermountain is pure gold. It's not just the biggest dungeon in the realms. It's one of the best launching pads for long-form, old-school mayhem you're ever going to find. So the Isle of Dread wasn't just a module, it was a revelation. It flung open the door to the wider world of D&D and said, hey, there's more to this game than crypts and castles. Up until that point, most adventures kept us rooted in medieval towns and torchlit dungeons, but Isle of Dread, it handed you a map, a longship, and a sense of wild discovery. Suddenly, you're in the tropics, hacking your way through dense jungle, running from dinosaurs, and making uneasy alliances with ancient tribes. It was pulp adventure in the purest sense, and it changed the way many of us looked at what a D&D campaign could be. What's truly brilliant about it is how it balances structure with freedom. You've got a clear goal: explore the island, deal with the temple, and try not to get eaten by the dinosaurs, right? But how you go about that is totally up to you. The sandbox design was ahead of its time, all right? And that island, it wasn't just a set piece. It lived. Every hex on the map promised something strange or dangerous, from cannibal villages to lost ruins, from sea serpents to forgotten gods. It's the kind of place that feels mythic even as you're carving your way through it. The jungle teems with possibility, and every decision feels like it might lead to treasure, doom, or both. For a lot of us old school folks, this is where the idea of wilderness adventure really began. It showed us that danger didn't have to be around the next corner. It could be everywhere. And it didn't just teach DMs how to run an open-ended exploration-heavy game. It invited them to make it their own, to add islands, gods, factions, and threats. That's why it's still on the table today. Whether you're running Moldvay Basic or some retro clone, right? Well, once you've journeyed to the Isle of Dread, it sticks with you. And honestly, it still makes me want to roll up a party, unfurl a weathered map, and set sail into the unknown. So Castle Amber is what happens when a fever dream and a fairy tale get together and decide to ruin your player's week, right? Like, this is one of those adventures where the party doesn't go to the dungeon. They wake up there, surrounded by poisonous mist, trapped in a mansion that pulses with surreal dread and unpredictable magic. The castle feels like it's half aware, half bored, and really just amused enough to toy with your players, right? The Amber family? Absolutely insane. And every hallway hums with that eerie mix of whimsy and menace that really only the best weird tales can deliver. You can feel the Clark Ashton Smith influence dripping from every page. This isn't your typical dungeon crawl. It's a jaunt through a haunted estate full of decadent nobles, time-slipped horrors, and monsters that look like they stepped out of a forgotten grimoire. The tone is unmistakable. It's rich, it's weird, and slightly off kilter, right? It keeps your players guessing, second guessing, and then screaming as a door vanishes behind them or a spell misfires in spectacular fashion. It's not horror that hits you over the head with a cleaver. It's the kind that whispers in your ear and makes you laugh a little before it starts chewing on your very soul. What makes Castle Amber so memorable, especially for us old school fans, is that it's boldly different. It's not afraid to be strange. It doesn't care about logic or balance. It cares about mood, mystery, and making your players feel like they're wandering through a living nightmare that's just a little too polite for its own good, right? There's a reason it's inspired multiple sequels and countless homages. It's the kind of adventure that sticks with you, not just because of what happens, but because of how it feels while it's happening, right? It's D&D at its most baroque and bizarre, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So Dead Gods isn't just a Planescape adventure. It's a full-throttle sprint through the multiverse with the apocalypse nipping at your heels. Monty Cook really knocked this one out of the astral plane. From the jump, you're not just chasing rumors or solving local disputes. You're in a desperate race to stop Orcus from clawing his way back to life. Yeah, that Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, written out a second edition with barely a whimper, only to come roaring back here in a blaze of bone and shadow. If you've been around the table long enough to remember his earlier reign of terror, seeing him make a comeback like this hits hard, trust me. What makes Dead Gods sing, aside from its razor-sharp pacing and, multiversal scope, is how it ties the present to the past. There's a return to the Vault of the Drow, and for Greyhawk veterans, that's like coming home to a place that tried to kill you and still wants another go, right? That sense of legacy runs deep, and it grounds all the big cosmic stakes in real familiar grit. But don't mistake this for nostalgia bait, right? Like, the tone is relentless. The clock is always ticking. Your players aren't just reacting. They're trying to outmaneuver cults, horrors, and ancient powers who would see the planes burn if it meant bringing their god back, right? And And it's not just the villain that's epic, it's the emotional weight. Every decision your players make matters. Every failure tightens the noose. There's dread, there's awe, and there's that delicious tension of knowing you're not just trying to win, you're trying to stop the impossible. If your group likes their adventures mythic, brutal, and dripping with consequence, Dead Gods is a masterclass in doing it right. Just, remind them this isn't a fight they walk away from unchanged, if they walk away at all, right? Dwellers of the Forbidden City is one of those modules that immediately transports you, not just to a place, but to a whole genre. David Cook gives us a ruined jungle city dripping with mystery, danger, and pulpy adventure in the grand tradition of Burroughs and Howard, right? Like, from the second your players step through the vines and catch their first glimpse of vine-choked plazas and moss-covered ziggurats, it feels like they're somewhere they're not supposed to be. This isn't just another dungeon dive, it's a sandbox teetering on the edge of collapse, full of rival factions, ancient secrets, and just enough structure to make everything feel like it matters. The city itself is the real star here. It breathes, it pulses, it's teeming with bullywugs, bugbears, Yuan-ti, and even stranger creatures, all locked in their own power struggle. That's what makes this one sing, the sense that the place would keep going even if your players turned around and left. They're not clearing the city, they're stepping into a living powder keg and deciding which spark they want to be, right? Like, whether your group wants to go full pulp hero and cleanse the place of evil, or play factions against each other for maximum chaos, there's room for both and then some. It's messy, it is, but in a good way, a little raw around the edges, sure, but that's part of its charm. You're not following a plot line here, you're surviving, you're adapting, and you're making choices that echo through a city that has its own rules. If you love giving your players the reins and letting them dig into a setting with depth, danger, and all the weird jungle flavor D&D can muster, then this one absolutely belongs on your shelf. It's one of the greats, and it feels great to run. So the Forge of Fury hits that perfect sweet spot between old school dungeon crawl and modern tactical challenge. It's the kind of adventure that feels familiar to veteran players, but keeps everyone on their toes with smart enemy behavior and a dungeon that rewards teamwork over brute force. It's not just about kicking in doors and killing goblins, though there's some of that for sure, right? It's about navigating a layered living fortress with history, secrets, and a very real sense of place. What makes this one so memorable for me is how it demands cooperation, right? Like, the monsters aren't speed bumps. They think, they move, they ambush. Suddenly, that cramped tunnel or narrow bridge, it isn't just set dressing, it's the battlefield. And if you're not working together, the dungeon is going to chew you up. And that's especially true when you get to Nightscale, the black dragon lurking in the flooded lower caverns. It's a perfect climax, tense, dynamic, and deadly. You're not just rolling dice, you're fighting for survival on shaky stone bridges over a subterranean lake, trying not to get picked off by a dragon that knows it has the home field advantage. It's a love letter to classic dungeon design, but with a modern coat of paint. There's weight to the exploration, depth to the lore, and a constant push for smarter play from your players. For groups that want a challenge they'll remember, one where every fight feels earned and every mistake has teeth, the Forge of Fury delivers. It's not just a great second step in a campaign, it's a fantastic standalone crawl that shows how to do Dwarven Ruins right. So the Gates of Firestorm Peak is one of those rare modules that dares to go all in on cosmic horror and pulls it off spectacularly. Yeah, it was built to showcase the second edition player's option rules, right? But that ends up being little more than set dressing. What really matters here is the vibe, a descent into a dark, squirming underworld of alien truths and forbidden knowledge, where the real danger isn't just what's lurking around the corner, but what happens to your mind the deeper you dig. Right from the jump, you know you're in for something different. This isn't about, loot or glory. It's about uncovering ancient secrets better left buried, and about facing horrors that bend the rules of reality. The tension ramps up beautifully, and it never lets go. It plays like a dungeon crawl written by someone who grew up on Lovecraft, but wanted to keep the magic of D&D intact, right? The result is unsettling in the best way. Arcane mysteries, reality warping entities, and a creeping realization that something is very wrong with the world as your players know it, right? For me, the brilliance of Firestorm Peak is how personal it feels. It's not just a showcase of creepy monsters. It's a story about knowledge, fear, and the line between courage and madness. The fact that this came out in an era when second edition adventures were often by the numbers, makes it stand out even more. It's bold, it's weird, and it's a perfect reminder that great adventures aren't just about what happens on the map. They're about what your players feel. If you're looking to inject a little existential dread into your campaign, or just want to see what happens when D&D flirts with the mythos, then this one deserves a place at your table for sure. So Return to the Tomb of Horrors is what happens when someone takes one of the most infamous meat grinder dungeons in D&D history and says, hey, let's go deeper, right? Like, Bruce Cordell didn't just expand Tomb of Horrors, he redefined it. This isn't just a remake of the classic Killer Crawl. It's an entire campaign wrapped in dread, mystery, and an escalating sense of doom, all orbiting around a Sararak's terrifying endgame. Where the original Tomb was about surviving one horrific gauntlet, this Return is about peeling back layers of horror until your players realize, just how screwed they are, right? Like, what makes this module shine isn't just its lethality, though don't worry, that's still front and center, right? It's the scope of the module. Cordell turns the tomb into the centerpiece of a much larger world. There's a cursed city, twisted cults, and a slow burn realization that Acererak's ambitions go beyond simple undeath. He's reaching for godhood, and the players are basically trying to punch a lich-shaped hole in fate itself. It's cosmic horror at a D&D scale, rich, complex, and terrifying. This is the kind of campaign that leaves a mark on your group, right? You don't just play Return to the Tomb of Horrors, you endure it. And when it's over, whether your players triumph or fail, they're going to walk away with stories. It's brutal, it's beautiful, and it's one of the most unforgettable experiences a DM can bring to the table. Just be sure to stock up on character sheets because trust me, you're going to need them. So White Plume Mountain is pure chaotic brilliance. The kind of dungeon that makes you laugh, scratch your head, and maybe scream a little when your fighter skids helplessly across a frictionless floor, right? Like, it's not about realism. It's not about gritty stakes or world-shaking consequences. It's about fun, delirious, puzzle-laden, wizard-cooked fun, right? This is the adventure where the rules of physics get tossed into the volcano right alongside your players' expectations. But that's what makes it unforgettable. You're not crawling through damp stone hallways dodging rats, right? You're fighting a giant crab in a glass dome under a lake. You're navigating reverse gravity water slides and trying to outwit a wizard who built his entire lair like an evil amusement park. White Plume Mountain is a love letter to the strange and the imaginative. And let's be real, half the reason people still talk about it is Black Razor, right? I mean, that sword isn't just loot, it's a narrative grenade just waiting to blow up your party's dynamics in the best way possible. If you want a break from grim realism and are ready to throw your players into a trap-filled funhouse with actual stakes, this is your ticket. It's bonkers, it's brilliant, and it's one of the most iconic modules ever made. Not because it's the most balanced or the most epic, but because it's just so much damn fun. So Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil isn't just a sequel, it's a reckoning. Bruce Cordell took the bones of one of the most iconic AD&D adventures ever published and built something bigger, darker, and more terrifying around them. This is the kind of campaign that doesn't just challenge your players, it dares them. With Tharizdun whispering madness from beyond the veil and cultists scrambling to unchain their cosmic nightmare, the stakes are existential from the jump, right? Like, you're not just dungeon crawling, you're standing between the world and oblivion. What makes this beast so effective is how it blends old school sensibilities with 3rd edition's crunch, right? The dungeon is sprawling, the factions are dynamic, and the threats, they aren't just physical, they're psychological, even spiritual. Every door opened could reveal a new horror or some subtle clue to a larger doom, right? It's got that slow creeping dread of Tharizdun baked into its very foundation. You feel the weight of the original Temple of Elemental Evil, but you also feel it shifting beneath your feet, twisted by something much older and honestly far more disturbing. If you're a fan of long-form, high-stakes campaigns that force your players to think, to plan, and to persevere, this is your holy grail. It's not an adventure you run on a whim. It's one you prepare for. It's an experience, a gauntlet of corruption, chaos, and cosmic horror that earns every bit of its reputation. This isn't just a love letter to a classic. It's the escalation, the evolution, the ultimate descent. In my opinion, it is a crime that this module did not crack the top 5. Keep on the Borderlands is the one that started it all for so many of us. Sure, it's not flashy. It's not particularly deep in terms of story, right? Hell, nobody in the Keep even has a name, right? But none of that matters. This was the adventure that defined what Dungeons & Dragons was for a whole generation, for my generation. It gave you a home base, a wilderness, and a dungeon. 3 distinct play pillars wrapped into one compact package. The Keep itself offered a sense of safety and routine, while the Caves of Chaos out in the ravine were pure chaos. Goblins, ogres, cultists, and an overwhelming sense that death was just one bad choice away. And it was. And that's the magic, right? It wasn't about telling some sweeping story or hand-holding your players through carefully balanced encounters. It was about discovery. It was about peeking into a cave and realizing too late that this wasn't the one you were ready for. It taught DMs how to improvise, and it taught players how to be careful, creative, and, maybe a little paranoid. It trusted the people at the table to figure it out. And in doing so, it created countless unforgettable moments of triumph and disaster. For many of us, this wasn't just our first module. It was our first real glimpse into what D&D could be, a living, breathing world where danger and wonder lurk just beyond the torchlight. Even now, decades later, Keep on the Borderlands remains a rock-solid intro to the game. You could drop it into any campaign world with minimum prep and watch it hum to life. It's truly a masterclass in simplicity, and sometimes that's all you need to make something truly legendary. So Desert of Desolation is one of those rare campaigns that does more than just challenge your players. It transports them. Originally written by Tracy and Laura Hickman and then later expanded into the legendary I3, I5 supermodule, this wasn't just another dungeon crawl. It was one of the first times TSR really pushed a narrative into a D&D module. You weren't just looting tombs, you were caught up in themes of fate, legacy, and lost glory, wandering through cursed pyramids, political intrigue, and dreamlike magical realms. And it all starts with your players being falsely accused and exiled into a desert where ancient magic and buried sorrow linger like the heat on the dunes. Each part of this trilogy brings something unique to the table. Pharaoh delivers a tomb full of brilliant puzzles and memorable traps. I mean, come on. That gravity reversing ceiling, really? Oasis of the White Palm dives into roleplay, heavy palace politics, and mysterious desert factions. And then Lost Tomb of Martek goes full on cosmic weirdness with mirror mazes, suspended platforms, and surreal magical riddles in a crystalline tomb built to hold a half-dead archwizard. The whole thing builds beautifully, giving players a true sense of progression from survival in the sand to shaping the fate of ancient powers. But what really elevates it, though, is the tone, right? There's a haunting beauty to the world. The ruins don't feel like set dressing. They feel like echoes of something real, something sacred and broken. And that mood sticks with you. This is a campaign about exploring forgotten legacies, righting ancient wrongs, and wrestling with magic that was never meant to be unearthed. It's pulp fantasy with a soul, right? And for my money, Desert of Desolation is one of the finest examples of how to run a story-rich, atmosphere-drenched campaign without losing that old school sandbox spirit. It honestly, it deserves every bit of praise it gets. Here we go, top 5. Expedition to the Barrier Peaks is the moment D&D shrugged off genre boundaries and said, yeah, let's throw a crashed spaceship into your medieval sandbox. I mean, what could go wrong? And you know what? It works. It's weird, audacious, and absolutely brilliant. What starts as your typical fantasy dungeon dive slowly, masterfully unfolds into full-blown sci-fi madness. Your players are crawling through metal corridors, fighting off security robots, and trying to figure out how to use alien tech manuals, all while still rolling d20s like it's just another Thursday night, right? Like, this adventure doesn't just mix genres, it fuses them into something unforgettable. You've got ray guns, malfunctioning androids, zero-gravity rooms, and that massive, lethal froghemoth waiting in the wings like the final boss of a fever dream. And then there's that indoor alien garden with the carnivorous bunny baiting plant, complete with before and after illustrations in the included art booklet, just to twist the knife. It's the kind of imagery that sticks in your brain for decades. I've seen grown players shiver at the memory of that peaceful garden. But what really makes Barrier Peaks sing, though, is how grounded it still feels in classic D&D. I mean, beneath the ray guns and robots, it's still about exploration, it's still about risk, and it's still about discovery. Monty Cook called it proof that the genre-blending approach could work, and he was dead right. It opened the door for so many DMs to try something different, something wild. It made it okay to mash together sword and sorcery with retro sci-fi and not lose the heart of the game. If you've never run it, you owe it to yourself and your players. Just don't blame me when they decide to keep the blaster pistols, okay? The Temple of Elemental Evil is one of those rare modules that doesn't just live up to the hype, it defines it. What began with the village of Hamlet, a cozy, believable little town, right, grew into an epic that helped set the standard for what a long-form D&D campaign could be, or should be. Hamlet felt alive with real people, layered relationships, and quiet hints of something darker stirring beyond the edge of town, right? And when the long-promised temple adventure finally dropped 6 years later, it exploded into a massive 5-level dungeon that didn't just deliver, it rewrote the book on what dungeon crawl should mean. This wasn't just a pile of rooms and monsters. The temple was a living, breathing battleground, a fortress of scheming factions, shifting alliances, and layered defenses that responded dynamically to your players' actions. Every choice mattered, every incursion carried weight, and buried deep inside were unforgettable moments like, the infamous vampire coffin containing Prince Thrommel, a tragic twist that caught countless parties off guard. It was equal parts strategy game, horror story, and sandbox, all fueled by the looming threat of Ayuz and the terrifying presence of Zugmoy, right? She wasn't just another demon boss, she was weird, alien, and absolutely deadly. The kind of foe that turns a bad day into a campaign-ending catastrophe. Temple of Elemental Evil didn't just inspire sequels, it inspired generations. Monty Cook built on it. Troika Games turned it into one of the best CRPGs of its era. It became a staple of Living Greyhawk, and through it all, it's held its place as a legendary benchmark in dungeon design. If you've never run it, now's the time. If you have, you probably still remember every twist, every faction play, and every time Zugmoy made someone roll up a new character. And that's the magic of it. It's not just an adventure, it's a rite of passage, something we all share. Tomb of Horrors isn't just an adventure, my friends. It's a trial by fire. It's a legend whispered among DMs and players alike. This is the dungeon where heroes go to die, right? Like, Gygax didn't design it to be fair, or even winnable in the traditional sense. He designed it to test your players, their wits, their caution, their paranoia, and, maybe some friendships along the way. It's a mind-bending labyrinth of riddles, false hopes, and traps so lethal, they've become a part of D&D legend. That green devil face, it's more than just an illustration. It's a character killer, an icon, and a warning label for everything that makes, Tomb of Horrors what it is. From the beginning, the module tells you this is not going to be fun. It's going to be unforgettable. There's a reason people still talk about it today, right? Whether you lost a character in the Sphere of Annihilation, had your alignment flipped by a cursed archway, or argued for half an hour about whether to touch the obviously trapped gem-encrusted crown on a skeletal corpse, you remember it. That's the magic. This wasn't about fighting monsters. This was about surviving Gygax's brain at its most cunning and cruel. Every inch of the tomb is a challenge, a dare, and sometimes a punchline. Running Tomb of Horrors is like inviting your group to a haunted house where the ghosts were written by a game designer with a wicked grin, right? It's not for every table. It's not. But if you want to give your players a story they'll retell forever, the time they stepped into the deadliest dungeon ever written, then Tomb of Horrors is your crucible. They might not all make it out, but the ones who do, they earn that story. I honestly can't believe this is number 2 on the list. It should be number 1. It is a crime that it is not number 1. Ravenloft did not just raise the bar, it smashed through the bar and redefined it. From the very first moment with a mysterious fortune reading that rewires the entire adventure depending on how the cards fall, you're pulled into a story where fate, fear, and narrative all take the lead. That Taroka card draw isn't just a gimmick. It's the engine that drives the whole experience. It makes Ravenloft feel alive, unpredictable, and hauntingly personal, no matter how many times you run it. And then there's Strahd. Count Strahd von Zarovich isn't just another villain lurking at the bottom of a dungeon. He's watching you. He's waiting. He's weaving himself into the narrative with a presence that feels more like Dracula than a hit point pinata. He's complex, he's tragic, he's calculating. A true gothic antagonist with agency and motive, not just stats. He speaks with your players, he toys with them, stalks them in his own castle. And what a castle it is, my friends. Castle Ravenloft is a masterclass in vertical dungeon design, brimming with secret passages, ominous catacombs, and unforgettable tricks. Like the teleportation trap that swaps a PC with a white. It's the kind of twist that makes jaws drop at the table and your players sweat, right? What makes Ravenloft so legendary isn't just its horror trappings or memorable villain. It's how it marries tone, gameplay, and innovation into one tight atmospheric package. I mean, it's only 32 pages long, and yet it contains more story, more style, and more unforgettable moments than most adventures 3 times its size. It was the blueprint for story-driven dungeon design, and it still holds up today. If you've never dared the mists of Barovia, you owe it to yourself and your players, because when Strahd smiles across the table and invites you to dance, you're going to remember it for the rest of your gaming life. And here we are, number 1. Queen of the Spiders is the ultimate descent, a sprawling saga that begins with a simple mission to deal with rampaging giants and ends in the swirling demonic chaos of the abyss. This is the super module that brings together the legendary G, D, and Q series into one brutal, unforgettable campaign. What starts as a giant slaying crawl turns into a high-stakes conspiracy against the surface world, pulling your players deeper and deeper through the Underdark, into the scheming web of the Drow, and finally, face-to-face with Lolth herself. It's the kind of campaign that starts in the hills and ends across the plains with a trail of broken villains and battle-scarred characters behind you, right? What makes this arc so enduring is how each chapter raises the stakes and shifts the tone. The Against the Giants trilogy hits hard with raw action and, tactical challenges. But by the time you're crawling through the Vault of the Drow or wandering the extra-planar strands of Lolth's demon web, it's not just about hit points, it's about survival, subterfuge, and truly cosmic horror. And the introduction of the Drow, instant classic. Arele Sinlu remains one of the most evocative, villain-filled cities ever published, dripping with paranoia, decadence, and opportunity. This isn't just a campaign, it's a legacy. It laid the groundwork for the Underdark. It made the Drow iconic and proved that modules could be as sweeping and ambitious as any fantasy novel. From the cold halls of fire giants to the web-choked layers of the abyss, Queen of the Spiders showed us what epic D&D really looks like. And if you're the kind of DM who lives for massive, interconnected campaigns full of danger, deceit, and divine stakes, well, this is the crown jewel. Okay, if you're still with me after all that, then I got a feeling you're exactly the kind of person that this series is for. These modules aren't just dusty relics or nostalgia bait. They're the foundation of how we tell stories at the table. And revisiting them with fresh eyes as a longtime DM who, still gets excited cracking the spine of a well-worn adventure is like rediscovering the bones of your favorite myths, right? Like, there's real treasure in these pages, and not just the kind that jingles in a coin pouch. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to dig deep. Each of these 30 adventures has its own flavor, its own quirks, and its own claim to greatness. Some are polished masterpieces, and others are just like glorious messes. And a few are bold experiments that never quite got the recognition they deserved. But I'll be unpacking them all. The good, the bad, the brilliant, and the baffling. With an eye toward what still works, what doesn't, and how to make them sing at your table today. And so, whether you've been playing for years or you're just discovering what made the early days of D&D so unforgettable, I promise you, it's going to be a hell of a ride. So I hope you stick around. But I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think of the list, the top 30 list. Which module is your favorite? Or is there a module that should be on the list that was left off? What do you think of the list? Let me know. I want to talk about it, right? And hey, if you want to revisit any of these adventures, great news, right? I've dropped links in the description where you can pick up your own copy of these modules. If you're interested, if you want to revisit them, run them at your table, or just follow along as I'm reviewing them over the coming weeks and months, right? Okay, that's going to do it for today, Stat Rollers. If you enjoyed this review, give it a like and click the video on the screen right now. YouTube thinks you're going to love it, and I think you're going to love it too, right? So until next time, may the dice roll ever in your favor.